The wind carried the sound of the morning train long before its smoke appeared on the horizon. Hollow Creek stirred awake in that golden haze of dawn, horses stamping by the hitching post, children trailing behind their mothers to fetch bread, and a lone figure standing by the station with her hands folded around a red scarf that fluttered like a dying flame. Her name was Maylin, 25, small and still against the western vastness, her black hair pinned neatly though the dust clung to it. The townsfolk had never seen anyone quite like her, and they watched as if she were an omen from a faraway place that had no right to exist here. She had been waiting since nightfall, though she did not tell anyone that. Her husband's letter, now creased and smudged, had promised work and safety in a place called Hollow Creek. But when she arrived, clutching that letter like a prayer, she was told he had died 2 weeks prior. Pneumonia, they said, buried by the river bend with no stone to mark his name. The words had left her hollow, yet she did not cry. There was a kind of silence inside her that tears could not reach. The train hissed, exhaling smoke into the sky, and the people dispersed like dry leaves. A man leaned against a wooden post at the far end of the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat low against the sun. His coat was the color of worn leather, and his eyes carried the tired calm of someone who had seen too many storms and learned to keep standing through all of them. Jackson Wade had come into town only for nails and kerosene. He hadn't planned to speak to anyone, least of all to her. But fate doesn't ask permission. Maylin clutched her small bundle of belongings and approached the boarding house across from the tracks. The sign read rooms for families and married couples. Her English was careful, fragile as the porcelain she once cleaned for strangers. "Please," she told the matron, Mrs. Jackson, a heavy woman with spectacles on her nose. "I need a room. Just, for a few days." Mrs. Jackson frowned. "Only married folk here, miss. Rules are rules." My husband," Maylin's voice caught like fabric on a nail. "He was coming. He died." The matron sighed, folding her arms. "Then I'm sorry for your loss. But I can't take in a single woman. Folks talk and I got a business to run." Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the faint sound of a church bell. Maylin stepped back into the street, the world blurring with dust and heat. She looked small against the endless road. Behind her, a few men leaned against the saloon post, muttering, "Another stray from the rail camps." Their laughter was low, careless. She ignored it, but her fingers trembled. That was when Jackson spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She turned. "You lookin' for a place to stay?" She hesitated, wary. "They say, only for married." He nodded once, studying her with the same quiet patience he gave a wild horse before touching its neck. "Then we'll say you are." She blinked. "I do not understand." "Tell her I'm your husband. For one day." He shifted his weight, eyes steady. "That'll get you a roof till you figure things out." Her throat tightened. "Why help me?" He looked past her toward the horizon, where the sunlight broke across the dry fields. "'Cause no one helped me once," he said simply. Mrs. Jackson's brows shot up when they entered together. "Didn't say you were married before." Jackson placed a hand gently against Maylin's back, a gesture so brief it might have been mistaken for habit. "We were wed in Abilene," he said, his voice even. "Didn't think it mattered to strangers." Mrs. Jackson stared between them, her suspicion melting into resignation. "You can take the back room. $2 a week. No noise, no trouble." When the door closed behind them, Maylin stood by the small window, staring at the pale curtains. The room smelled of soap and old pine. Jackson removed his hat, set it on the dresser, and said nothing. The silence was thick but not cruel. It was the kind of silence that left space for breath. She whispered, "Thank you, mister," and trailed off, realizing she didn't even know his name. "Jackson Wade," he said, tightening the strap of his worn satchel. "You got anyone left?" She shook her head once. "No one." He nodded. "Then rest. I'll bring food from the tavern." When he left, she sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the faded stitching of the quilt. The window light softened, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to feel tired. Outside she could hear laughter, gossip already spreading through town. The rancher brought home a foreign bride. Probably bought her off the train. Every whisper pressed against her ribs like a weight. She pressed her hands over her ears and breathed until the sound faded into the wind. That night, Jackson returned with bread and beans, setting the tin plate on the table without ceremony. He ate standing by the door as if ready to leave at any moment. Maylin watched him, noticing the faint scar near his jaw, the quiet way he avoided looking directly at her. "You have family?" she asked softly. "Had." His eyes flicked to the window. Lost my wife 3 winters ago. I am sorry. He shrugged, though the gesture didn't reach his face. Storm took the roof. Fever took her. Sometimes I think the wind keeps what it wants. Her gaze fell to the red scarf beside her plate. Yes, she said almost to herself. The wind carries everything we cannot hold. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression softened as if he recognized the same hollow note ringing inside her. Neither spoke again. The lamp between them flickered low, casting gold over her tired face and the worn curve of his hands. When the night deepened, the sound of horses echoed faintly from the street. Jackson rose. You locked the door behind me, he said. I'll be by come morning to square rent. She nodded. Only for one day, yes? He hesitated at the threshold, hat in hand. The wind caught his coat, lifting its hem like a black wing. One day, he said. We'll see what the morning brings. The door closed with a soft click, and the quiet that followed was heavy and strange. Malin stood by the window, watching his shadow move through the lantern-lit street until it disappeared into dust and darkness. For the first time since she'd come west, she wasn't sure if she'd found shelter, or stepped into a storm shaped like a man. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, painting the boarding room in muted gold. The air smelled faintly of starch and soap, of a life that tried hard to stay clean despite the dust pressing in from every side. Malin folded the blanket she had slept beneath, smoothing its wrinkles with deliberate care, as though neatness could hold the world steady. Outside, she could already hear the town murmuring, boots scuffing wood, laughter sharp as broken glass, and somewhere a child calling his mother. Every sound reminded her she did not belong. Jackson was already awake, standing by the window with his sleeves rolled up, the first sunlight touching the rough lines of his face. He looked like a man carved from the land itself, weathered, quiet, and unmovable. He turned slightly when she spoke. You did not sleep, she said softly. I've had worse nights, he replied. Storm season'll be worse still. She studied his reflection in the glass, that faint glint of sadness behind his calm. There was something about the way he stood, as if he had been holding up a roof that no one else saw for far too long. Downstairs, Mrs. Jackson greeted them with a look that landed heavy between curiosity and judgment. Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Wade, she said, each word sugar-dipped and barbed. Her eyes flicked to Mayleen's hands to the small tin of coins she carried. Rent's due at week's end. Town's full of folk who forget to pay once the pretending stops. Jackson nodded once. Won't be a problem. When they stepped out into the sunlit street, Maylin felt the town's gaze trail after them. The butcher pausing mid-cut, the seamstress turning from her window. The air itself seemed to carry whispers. She's the one. The foreign woman. The words pressed against her back like stones. She walked a little behind Jackson, her head bowed, her hands twisting the edge of her scarf. At the general store he bought flour, salt, and nails, speaking to no one longer than necessary. Maylin lingered by the door, staring at the bolts of cloth stacked behind the counter. Red, blue, cream. She touched one gently, the way she used to touch silk in her father's shop in Guangzhou, before everything burned. The storekeeper's wife noticed and pulled the cloth away, her lips tight. Not for touching, miss. We sell by the yard. Maylene's cheeks warmed. Jackson saw it, the small flinch, and stepped forward. Put a yard on my bill, he said, voice even. The woman hesitated. You sure? Ain't cheap. He placed the coins down without a blink. Maylin opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head. Let them see you've got the right to touch what you please. They left in silence, the fabric folded neatly in her hands. As they walked, she whispered, You should not spend for me. He didn't answer right away. You shouldn't have to ask permission to exist. The wind rose again, pushing grit through the street. He lifted his hat against it, she held the cloth close. For a moment, the world blurred to nothing but dust and the sound of her own breath. When it cleared, she found herself watching him differently, not as a stranger, but as someone who had chosen kindness even when it cost him something invisible. By noon they returned to the boarding house. Maylin offered to cook. Jackson sat at the small table, mending a strap on his satchel, watching her quietly as she worked. She moved with practiced grace, washing rice in a basin, slicing herbs she had gathered behind the stables. The scent rose warm and gentle through the room. He hadn't smelled food like that in years. When she handed him a bowl, he nodded once. Smells good. She smiled faintly. It is simple food, but made with care. He took a bite and exhaled softly, as if the taste reminded him of something long buried. Care's in short supply here. The meal passed quietly. Outside, the afternoon light turned amber. The rhythm of hoofbeats came and went. Then a sharp knock on the door broke the stillness. Mrs. Jackson entered without waiting to be invited, her arms folded, mouth tight. "Had a few folks come by asking about you too," she said. "You're stirring talk." Jackson's jaw tensed. "Let them talk." She glanced at Maylin. "I don't mind boarders, but Hollow Creek's not kind to outsiders. Might be better if your wife stayed in some days. Fewer eyes that way." After she left, Maylin stood by the window, silent. The lace curtain moved against her hand like breath. "She means I should hide," she said. Jackson's gaze softened. "She means this town's blind. Doesn't know what to do with what it can't name." The room dimmed as clouds rolled in, muting the edges of the day. Maylin sat at the small table, stitching the cloth he'd bought her. Each motion was steady, careful. Jackson leaned back, watching the thread move between her fingers. He thought of his late wife, how different her laughter had been, loud and unbroken. This woman before him was made of quieter things. Grace worn thin by exile, dignity sharp enough to cut. When the first drops of rain tapped the window, Maylin looked up. "Do you believe heaven watches us?" He hesitated, eyes tracing the slow drift of rain. "If it does, it's got a cruel way of showing care." She nodded. "Maybe heaven is tired too." That night, thunder rolled across the hills, far off yet steady. The townsfolk huddled indoors, whispering about the stranger and her supposed husband. A story was already growing, that Jackson had bought her, that she had cursed her last master, that she'd brought the rain itself. Gossip, like floodwater, finds every crack. Maylin heard the voices through the floorboards. She sat awake, hands folded tight in her lap. When Jackson entered, his coat damp from the storm, she rose. "They will hate you for helping me," she said. He wiped his hands with a cloth. "They hated me long before you came." "Why?" He met her eyes then, tired, honest. "'Cause I remind them of what they lost. I stayed when they ran." She did not understand fully, but she felt the weight in his tone. "And what did you lose?" He gave a small hollow laugh. "Everything that had a name." She stepped closer, the lantern light trembling between them. "Then maybe I can give something back. You lend me a name for one day. Let me keep it till tomorrow." The air between them grew still, the sound of rain filling it. He didn't answer, but his eyes lingered, steady, unreadable, softer than before. Maylin placed the red scarf on the table beside the folded cloth and whispered, "Tomorrow I will find work. I will earn my keep. And then you may forget me." He looked away, jaw tight. "Maybe," he said quietly, though the word felt like a lie. Outside, the wind carried a train's distant whistle through the storm. It sounded almost human, lonely, searching. In the flicker of the lamplight, two shadows leaned closer than strangers should, yet not close enough to touch. Somewhere beyond the walls, Hollow Creek kept whispering their borrowed names, not knowing that by morning, neither would belong to them the same way again. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet soil and pine. Hollow Creek glimmered under the pale sun like a town that had forgotten its sins for a morning. Jackson loaded his wagon in silence, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each gesture were an old habit he'd worn threadbare over the years. Maylin stood nearby with her hands folded, her scarf tied against the chill, watching the fog curl through the trees beyond the tracks. He had told her they'd be leaving the boarding house. "Town's too small for mercy," he'd said. She hadn't argued. She'd learned already that the quiet in his voice meant decision. So now, as the wagon rattled through the narrow street, the townsfolk watched them go. The blacksmith paused mid-swing, the preacher's wife turned from her porch. No one spoke, but their stares followed the wagon until it disappeared into the open plain. The road out of Hollow Creek was red clay and memory. The world opened wide and empty, fields brushed with yellow grass stretching to the horizon. Maylin sat beside him, her small hands gripping the seat as the wheels lurched over ruts. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was thick with things that had no words yet. She studied him when he wasn't looking. The sharp line of his jaw, the scar near his ear, the way his eyes softened when the wind moved through the grass. "You live alone?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "Since my wife passed. House is too big, but it don't complain." She hesitated. "You miss her?" He didn't answer immediately. The reins creaked as he adjusted them. "Every day," he said finally. "But grief's like a mule, you stop feeding it, it just waits till you do." Maylin looked at the road ahead. "In my country we burn paper houses for the dead. So they have a home on the other side." "Maybe that's kinder," he murmured. "Here we just let the cold take what it wants." The wagon turned toward a ridge where the land folded into a shallow valley. There, between cottonwoods and a creek that shimmered like glass, stood the ranch, weathered boards, a slanted barn, a windmill creaking against the sky. It wasn't large, but it looked like a place where things endured. Jackson stopped the wagon near the porch. "Ain't much, but it keeps the rain off." Maylin stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. She breathed in the scent of horses and hay, of rain-soaked timber. It felt strangely alive, as though the land itself were listening. Inside, the cabin was clean but bare. A single table, a few shelves, the hearth blackened from years of fire. She traced a finger along the edge of the mantel, pausing at a small wooden horse carved with care. "You made this?" she asked. "My father did," he said. "Used to say a man ought to leave something small behind that don't break easy." She smiled faintly. "Then he left you." He looked up from removing his coat, eyes caught between surprise and something gentler. "Maybe he did." The first days passed quietly. Jackson worked the fields while Maylin tended to the house. She patched torn shirts, scrubbed the floors, and cooked with the few things she found: cornmeal, beans, a jar of honey so old it tasted of smoke. The rhythm of labor steadied her, like prayer. Sometimes through the window she'd watch him drive fence posts beneath the sun, his movements strong but unhurried. He never shouted, never cursed the stubborn ground. He simply worked the same way he breathed, slow, necessary. At dusk he'd return, hat in hand, and the two would share supper without ceremony. Their talk was small: weather, livestock, the color of the sky. Yet beneath those quiet exchanges ran something unspoken, a slow recognition that two broken lives had begun to orbit the same silence. One evening, while gathering laundry by the creek, Maylin heard the distant rumble of hooves. Two men rode up the path toward the ranch, Deputy Garth and a rail foreman, both with faces set hard. She froze as their horses halted near the porch. "Wade," Garth called, his voice sharp with authority. "You harborin' that foreign woman up here?" Jackson straightened from the trough, water dripping from his hands. "She's my wife," he said evenly. Garth's lip curled. "Funny, folks in town don't recall any weddin'. You keep her here, you'll find yourself with more than gossip to answer for." The rail foreman spat into the dirt. "She ran from her contract. Belongs to the company. You hand her over and we'll forget this happened." Jackson's hand brushed the handle of his axe, but his voice stayed low. "Ain't nobody's property on this land." The two men exchanged a glance. Garth leaned forward on his saddle. "You think bein' Wade means the law bends for you? Town's patience is runnin' thin." Maylin stepped into view then, her skirt hem damp from the creek, eyes steady. "If they come for me," she said softly, "let them take me. I won't cause trouble." Jackson turned, his expression unreadable. "You're stayin', dot." His voice left no space for argument. The men lingered a moment longer before riding off, dust rising behind them. Silence returned to the valley, but it was heavier now, like thunder waiting for a cue. That night the fire burned low. Maylin sat near the hearth, sewing by lamplight. Jackson stood by the window, watching the moon slide over the hills. "You didn't have to speak for me," she said. "Didn't do it for you," he replied. "Did it, 'cause no man owns another." Her needle paused. "Still, I am sorry for the trouble." He turned slightly, shadows carving the planes of his face. "You ain't the trouble, Maylin. The trouble's folks who can't stand to see peace where they expect shame." She looked down, blinking fast. "I have lived my life asking to be unseen. Maybe it is time I learned to be seen." He said nothing, but something in him shifted. For the first time he saw not the frightened widow from the train platform, but a woman forged by survival, her gentleness no longer submission but choice. Days passed into a rhythm neither spoke of. She planted herbs near the porch. He built her a fence to keep the rabbits out. When she laughed, quietly as though testing the sound, it startled him. It had been years since laughter felt like sunlight. One afternoon as she swept the porch, she found a small bird tangled in twine near the fence post. Its wing was torn. She cupped it gently, whispering words in her own tongue, and carried it inside. Jackson watched as she cleaned the wound with trembling care, her eyes shining with stubborn hope. "It might not make it," he said softly. She glanced at him. "Then it will not die alone." Something in that sentence rooted itself deep in him. That evening, after she'd fallen asleep, he stepped outside, looking toward the horizon where Hollow Creek shimmered faintly under starlight. He thought of the grave behind the church, of his wife's name carved into cold stone, and of the woman now sleeping beneath his roof, a stranger who asked for nothing and gave peace in return. The bird lived. By morning, it fluttered weakly to the windowsill and vanished into the open sky. Maylin smiled when she saw it gone. He found his way home. Maybe he just stayed where he was meant to, Jackson said. Later that day, while chopping wood near the barn, he heard the distant clatter of hooves again. 2 riders, different men this time, crossed the ridge. They stopped when they saw him, then turned back toward town. He felt the warning settle in his gut like a stone. Trouble wasn't gone, it was gathering. As dusk bled into night, Maylin lit the lamp and placed it on the windowsill. Light helps the lost find their way, she said. He stared at the flickering glow against the glass, the warmth spilling into the dark. Or it shows them where to aim, he murmured. Their eyes met across the small room, the quiet between them charged, trembling with unspoken things. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the grass like a secret. And somewhere beyond the hills, a gun's distant echo cracked the stillness, one sharp sound swallowed by the night, leaving only the soft, steady creak of the windmill turning, and the heavy silence of a man who finally knew the storm had found him again. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky stretched pale and endless, and the next it darkened like a mood changing behind the eyes. The wind rushed down from the hills, bending the cottonwoods till they looked like bowing silhouettes in the fading light. Jackson felt it before it broke. He could smell the iron in the air, the coming violence of rain. He was out by the corral when the first drops fell, big as coins, hammering against the dirt. In the distance, the cattle lowed uneasily, and thunder rolled like a slow drumbeat over the valley. Maylin stood on the porch, skirts whipping around her legs, watching him fight the gate latch as if the storm itself were an enemy. She called out, her voice thin against the wind, "Come inside." He shook his head, gesturing toward the barn. The sky split open with a flash that made her flinch. Lightning, sharp and blinding, turned the world white for an instant. Then came the rain, sudden and heavy, soaking her within seconds. She grabbed the lantern by the door and ran toward the barn, shielding it under her shawl. The ground had already turned to mud. Her boots slipped as she stumbled forward. Jackson was trying to coax the horses inside, his shirt plastered to his skin. "You shouldn't be out here," he shouted over the roar. "They're scared," she cried, breathless. "I can help." Together they pulled open the heavy barn doors. The horses bolted past them into shelter, hooves thundering like heartbeats. The smell of hay and sweat filled the air. Jackson caught her arm just as a gust slammed the door shut behind them. The lantern flickered wildly, casting gold light over their faces. She looked up at him, rain dripping from her lashes, her breath quick and ragged, and for a moment the whole world felt still. Outside the wind howled. Inside, there was only the sound of water dripping and their lungs finding rhythm again. He released her arms slowly, his hand trembling in the air between them before falling away. "You could have been struck," he said, quieter now. "You would have stayed," she replied. "I couldn't leave you." The words struck him harder than the rain. For a second he couldn't find his voice. He turned toward the stalls, pretending to check the horses. "Storm will pass soon." But it didn't. It worsened. The rain beat down in furious sheets, drumming the roof till it seemed the barn itself might split apart. They worked side by side, tightening ropes, covering feed sacks. Maylin's braid came loose, strands clinging to her wet cheek. Jackson found himself watching her move through the chaos, small, determined, unyielding, as if she were the calm heart inside the storm. When it was over an hour later, the wind still raged, but the worst had passed. The barn was warm with the heat of animals and lantern light. Maylin leaned against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself. Jackson handed her his coat, still damp but less so than her dress. "Take this," he said. She hesitated, then draped it over her shoulders. The coat hung heavy, smelling of cedar and smoke. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she said softly, "In China, when storms came, my mother used to say heaven was angry because people forgot to be kind." He gave a faint smile. "Then heaven's been mad a long time here." The roof creaked under another gust, but it held. Lightning flashed again, throwing their shadows onto the wooden beams, 2 figures close but still divided by space and silence. Maylin sank to the ground, hugging her knees. "I think of her often," she said. "She was kind even when the world was cruel. I try to be like her. But sometimes I feel too small to carry her grace." Jackson crouched beside her, his boots squelching in the mud. "Ain't small to keep going. Takes strength most folks don't have." Her eyes glistened. "You sound like someone who knows." He looked at the floorboards. "I used to believe silence could keep things safe. That if I just worked, didn't feel, didn't ask, the world might pass me by and let me alone. But the world doesn't leave the quiet ones alone. It finds them every time. She reached for his hand without thinking, just a light touch. Then maybe it's not punishment. Maybe it's asking you to speak. The touch lingered, soft as breath. He didn't pull away. Outside, thunder grumbled, softer now, like a tired apology. Later, when the worst of it eased, they stepped to the barn door. The valley shimmered beneath the rain, silvered by flashes of lightning. Jackson lifted the latch, and the storm wind blew hard enough to push them both back. The creek had overflowed, swallowing the path. Malin gasped. "Your field?" "It'll hold," he said, though worry creased his brow. "Always does." She turned toward him, hair tangled, eyes luminous in the dark. "Why do you stay here when the world keeps hurting you?" He studied her face, her question cutting clean through the noise. "Because leaving don't fix what's broken inside," he said quietly. "You patch it where it's split, even if it's the same piece of land that caused the wound." Rain softened to a steady whisper. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And if it isn't the land that's broken, but the heart?" He met her gaze, lightning catching in his eyes. "Then maybe it just needs someone brave enough to hold it steady till it beats again." The space between them disappeared. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers careful as if touching something sacred. For a heartbeat, time stopped. No storm, no past, just breath and the quiet understanding that two lost souls had found shelter in each other. But the world as always intruded. A shout carried through the rain, angry, distant, but close enough to twist Jackson's gut. He moved to the doorway, squinting through the downpour. Lanterns bobbed on the ridge above the valley. Men on horseback. At least 3, maybe more. Malin came to his side, her voice breaking. "They've come again." Jackson's jaw set hard. "Let them." The riders descended slowly, mud spraying beneath their hooves. Deputy Garth led them, slicker flapping in the wind. "Evenin', Wade," he called out. "Heard you were harborin' a thief." Jackson stepped out from the barn, rain streaming down his face. "She's done nothing wrong." Garth sneered. "She's property of the railroad. You don't hand her over, I'll see this place burned to cinders." Jackson said nothing. Behind him, Malin's hand trembled around the lantern. Its light cast a trembling halo over his back. "Move aside, Wade," one of the riders said. "Ain't worth it." Jackson took a slow step forward, the mud sucking at his boots. "Every man decides what's worth it," he said, voice low but clear. For a breathless second, no one moved. Then thunder cracked overhead, splitting the sky. Garth's horse reared, startled, and Malin gasped. Jackson seized the moment, yanking the rifle from the wagon bed beside the barn. He didn't raise it to aim, just held it firm in both hands. The men flinched back instinctively, the illusion of his stillness breaking like glass. "Nobody dies tonight," he said, voice like iron. "Not here. Not for hate." The storm raged louder, the wind shrieking through the trees. Garth's face twisted, but something in Jackson's stance made him falter. "You'll regret this," he spat, turning his horse. One by one, the others followed, their lanterns vanishing into the rain. When they were gone, Jackson lowered the rifle slowly. His breath came heavy. Malin ran to him, clutching his sleeve. "They'll come again," she whispered. "I know." He looked out at the valley where the creek had begun to recede. "But I'm done runnin'. The rain eased into a soft drizzle, the storm's fury spent. The air smelled of iron and earth and something new, hope or maybe its echo. They stood together under the dripping eaves, the barn behind them glowing faintly from the lantern's warm pulse. Malin's voice was quiet. "You could have died." "So could you," he said. "Yet here we are." The silence that followed was not empty but full of everything neither had dared say. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath against the damp chill. Her eyes held him, steady and brave. "If the storm comes again," she said, "we face it together." He exhaled slowly, nodding once. The thunder rolled far away now, like the sound of something leaving. But as lightning faded beyond the hills, another light flickered in the distance. Unnatural, bright, and moving toward the ranch. Jackson's gaze hardened. Not lightning this time. Torches. He turned to Malin, his voice low and certain. "It ain't over yet." The torches came through the dark like a swarm of angry stars. Their light flickered across the wet valley, painting the soaked earth in cruel orange. Malin stood in the doorway, the lantern trembling in her hand, her face pale but steady. Jackson stepped out into the open, his coat clinging to him, his rifle slung low at his side. The storm had passed, but the world felt just as dangerous. Only quieter now, the kind of silence that waits for someone to make the first mistake. There were 6 men this time. Garth at the front, his mouth drawn into a hard line, the others behind him, railroad men drunk on righteousness and whiskey. The firelight turned their faces into masks of gold and shadow. Jackson could feel Maylene's breath behind him, soft and quick. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. "Wade," Garth called, voice rough. "You were warned. Hand her over and no one gets hurt." Jackson's voice came calm and cold. "You've been hurt a long time, Garth. Can't fix that by burning someone else's peace." Garth spat into the mud. "Don't play preacher with me. That woman ain't yours. She's run property. And you? You're a fool who forgot what side of the fence he stands on." Jackson's fingers tightened around the rifle, but his tone didn't rise. "There's only one side worth standing on, the one where a person's more than a damn piece of paper." The words rippled through the men like heat. One of them shifted in his saddle, uneasy. Garth saw it and snarled. "You think you can buy holiness, Wade? You think money makes you right?" "I don't buy anything anymore," Jackson said. "I just don't sell my soul for cheap." The tension snapped like glass. Garth raised his revolver. Maylene gasped. The shot tore through the night, cracking open the silence. Jackson dropped to one knee, not from the bullet, it missed, but to return the fire. He shot high, a warning, the sound echoing like thunder through the hollow. Horses reared. One man cursed, another lost his grip. The torches wavered, a few falling into the wet grass. "Go home," Jackson said, his voice like iron, "before you bring shame to your own wives and daughters." For a moment no one moved. Then slowly the men turned their horses, muttering among themselves. Garth lingered, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "The law won't stand with you." Jackson met his eyes. "Then I'll stand alone." Garth left. The last torchlight disappeared over the ridge. The night closed in again, dark and wide and heavy with relief. Jackson exhaled, lowering the rifle. Behind him, Maylene's small sob cracked the air. He turned. She dropped the lantern and ran to him, her hands trembling as they touched his arms, his chest, searching for wounds that weren't there. "You could have died," she whispered. He caught her hands in his. "So could they," he murmured. "But maybe they'll think twice before killing, something kind again." Her tears came fast then, the kind that fall when fear finally has no strength left to hide. He held her close beneath the half-collapsed awning, their shadows one shape against the rain-streaked barn. The world smelled of smoke and earth and spent courage. When dawn came, the valley lay still and silver, steam rising from the soaked grass. Jackson stood at the porch rail, looking out at the wreckage, the churned mud, the trampled fence, the burned patch where a torch had died. Maylene brought him coffee in a tin cup. He took it with a nod. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, "They will return, won't they?" He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass like a long breath. "Maybe," he said. "But I don't reckon they'll find the same man waiting." She looked up at him, her eyes tired but bright. "You were brave." He shook his head. "No. Just tired of losing the good things to men who mistake fear for power." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's what bravery is." They spent the morning rebuilding what the storm and men had broken. She gathered the scattered hay, humming a tune soft and low. He replaced the broken rails with slow, deliberate care. It was work, but it was peace, the kind that comes only after chaos. Once he looked over and caught her humming again, sunlight spilling across her face. Something inside him, quiet for too long, stirred awake. By afternoon a rider came down the trail. It was Preacher Cole, his gray beard damp from the mist. "Heard there was trouble," he said gently, dismounting. "The whole town's talking." Jackson's expression didn't change. "They always are." The preacher studied him for a moment. "They say you stood for her. Alone." "I didn't stand alone," Jackson replied. "She stood too." Cole nodded, his eyes softening. "Then maybe it's time you stand together properly." Jackson blinked. "You mean?" The preacher smiled faintly. "If a name is what keeps peace, then give her yours for real. Make the lie into truth." Maylene, who had been listening from the doorway, lowered her gaze. The color rose to her cheeks. Jackson looked at her, then at the preacher, then out toward the fields. The wind bent the grass in waves like a breathing sea. "She deserves to choose that herself," he said quietly. The preacher turned to her. "Child, what do you want?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "A home that cannot be taken." The preacher nodded, as though he had been waiting for that answer all along. "Then let's build it." They married that evening beneath the same cottonwood where the storm had first broken. The preacher said few words, the sky said the rest. Jackson's hand shook slightly as he placed the ring, a simple band of polished silver, on her finger. She looked at him, her eyes full of something steady and new. Not just love but faith. When the sun fell behind the ridge, they stood on the porch, watching light fade from the land. The world smelled of wild mint and rain-soaked dust. The silence between them felt different now, not an emptiness but a fullness, a language of its own. She leaned against him, whispering, "You said one day." He smiled, the first real one she'd ever seen from him. Reckon that day never ended. The stars came out slow, one by one, until the whole sky shimmered. Somewhere far off, an owl called, and the creek whispered over stones like a lullaby. Jackson looked down at her hand in his, her small fingers entwined with his rough ones, and felt something unbreakable settle inside him. But as the night deepened, a distant rumble echoed from beyond the ridge, low, rolling, unmistakable. Not thunder this time. A dozen, maybe more. Mayleen's head lifted, her breath catching. Jackson turned toward the sound, his body tense, his eyes narrowing toward the darkness. "They're coming again," she whispered. He squeezed her hand once, steady, calm. "Let them come," he said. "This time they'll find us together." The wind rose, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the direction of town. The stars trembled in their reflections over the creek. Jackson reached for the rifle leaning against the porch post, then paused. He set it aside. Instead, he wrapped his arm around Mayleen's shoulders, pulling her close as the sound of riders grew louder in the distance. In that heartbeat before the next storm, everything slowed, the glow of the lantern, the warmth of her against his side, the memory of all they had endured. He looked at her once more, and she met his gaze with the same quiet fire that had carried her this far. When the hoofbeats thundered across the valley and torches flared again, the ranch light burned brighter still, unmoved and unafraid, two souls standing against the dark, bound by the one day that refused to end.